Welcome back to another episode of A Mental Health Break with Vincent A. Lanci. I'm excited to launch another episode for you all. I'm Vincent Lanci, speaker and author of the book Left for Dead, A Story of Redemption. When I was 21 years old, I was the victim of a hit-and-run accident while walking home from a friend's birthday. After coming out of a coma and suffering from a traumatic brain injury, or you may know of as a TBI, I soon realized that it was time to put my mental health on a very high pedestal. This transformative experience has led me to create a podcast that is all things mental health. Would it benefit you to hear from mental health professionals and influencers? Would it also add value to your life to hear real life and authentic stories from people talking about their mental health, the issues they face, and how they actively combat them? If you answered yes to any of those questions, you came to the right place. I want to start by congratulating you for making your mental health a priority. If you missed the last episode, be sure to download it after you tune in today. On this episode, I am happy to introduce my guest, Sharice Bradford. She is a trauma recovery expert and also a life strategist who will provide that unique perspective on mental health today. In addition to being an author and speaker, she also focuses on mental health relating to divorces. She is also the editor of Dimensioned Wellness Magazine, a magazine for life coaches that launched back in January 2018. She got a very big heart when it comes to mental health, so I'm happy to have her on the show. Sharice, thanks for coming on my show today.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Absolutely. Would you mind please previewing your story, introduce yourself to our listeners before we dive in and get going, and also please share your role relating to mental health?
Absolutely. My name is Dr. Sharice. I was born and raised in Chicago. My life sort of began as a traumatic experience. I was the product of teenage parents who my grandmother told me once that I was reincarnated. And what she meant by that was my mother had gotten pregnant at the age of 16, and my grandparents forced her to have an abortion. And 6 weeks later, she was pregnant again, and now I'm here. So that was my reincarnation story. So I would say that my life began in a bed of trauma. And growing up, I was molested at the age of 9. And both of my parents, as I grew up, became substance abusers. So I dealt with that. I was primarily raised by my maternal grandmother, who happened to be a functional alcoholic. So I've seen a lot, I've experienced a lot. And what I am passionate about is making sure. It took me the majority of my life, almost 30 years, to find a balance to recover from the trauma. And you'll always be in recovery.
Right.
So there will be things that trigger you. There will be things that come up, so you learn how to navigate that and deal with those things in isolated incidents. But I don't want other people to have to wait 30 years, 40 years, 50 years before they begin the road to recovery. And so that is my passion. And that led me to pursue my doctorate in counseling psychology because I feel like I wanted to have that extra level of preparation. I wanted to be able to not just, when you are a trauma survivor, you can connect with other people who are going through trauma. There are things that you see. I have had a passion for working with kids, and I can always, most of the time, the kids that had the most problems were drawn to me. And it was because I could see that there was something not wrong, that as a child, the light had gone out in their eyes, and they had a heaviness that you're not supposed to have as a child. And so I connected with that. And so I received my doctorate in counseling psychology, and I am focused on just really what I say a lot of times is helping people recover, rediscover, and redefine themselves. Because when you go through any type of mental health situation, there is a recovery, a rediscovery, and a redefining process that you go through. And so I find myself as sort of a midwife in helping people to get there.
Yeah, and I like, how you touched on how it's a process, in an episode earlier it came up that recovery, it's not a destination, it's a journey.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so thank you so much for sharing all that information. I always love when I can have individuals come on the show and not only share professional experiences, but also personal. So I'm very excited for the value that you're about to deliver today. But Sharice, something I do on each episode is I introduce a story related to mental health of someone who is famous because I want to let you, the listeners, know that you are not alone. I want you to understand that even though someone looks like they are healthy from the outside, they may not be on the inside too. I'll now introduce the mental health related story of Olivia Munn from an article I found on WebMD. For those of you who don't know that name, she's a famous actress who has opened up about her mental health difficulties and challenges. These difficulties actually started with her growing up, where a sense of acceptance was described as, quote, hard earned for her. She also added a quote in saying, I didn't start out feeling comfortable with how I looked. I grew up with a sister who had this very voluptuous body, and other girls at school were all tall and thin, and I wasn't those things. She won her confidence after several tries, starting with unhealthy eating habits, unhealthy diet habits. She said in another quote, I was never the weight I wanted to be. In 2009, I lost 16 pounds because I came up with the rule of if I don't see it, I don't eat it, which meant I had to actually see the ingredients, but my weight has always fluctuated. I want to delve a little deeper here because I think it can relate to a lot of people listening, as she also started to have panic attacks, which she credited to seasonal asthma, until one day she actually passed out and ended up in the ER. She wasn't really taking that early sign. She went to a therapist, started seeing a hypnotist to help manage her anxiety and resulting trichotillomania, excuse my mispronunciation if I did, but which is the urge to pull out hair anywhere on the body, which for her, extended to the scalp, eyelash, and eyelashes. She had a lot going on. And I'd like to include just one more quote to tie up this wrap up. And she said, I live with anxiety a lot. And I think when people have anxiety attacks, we don't want to talk about it because the people who don't understand make you feel like you're going crazy, even though you're not. She added, I found that the more I can talk to people about it, the less alone I feel, and that people are more compassionate about it than you realize. And obviously, she's tried new methods, exercise, yoga to balance and offset her mental health, depression, and anxiety. I know that was a lot of information, but I had to include it because of how valuable I thought it was. Sharice, what's your takeaways on this?
So I have two major takeaways. One is she talked about body image issues, which a lot of people deal with, and as a result of peer pressure. And that is something that is so common, and we see it so much more today with bullying and people. Even I think more society is getting out of it because you're starting to see more plus size models. You're starting to see more plus size women and average size women represented in, ad campaigns, television commercials, that type of thing. It's still not the societal norm. However, that was one of the things is the peer pressure and the body image issue. The other thing is a lack of balance.
Yes.
When she spoke about the panic attack, having the asthma attack, which led to her passing out from a panic attack, she wasn't dealing with the primary issue, which was the asthma attack. She's focusing on everything else. And anxiety is us worrying about something that has not yet happened. If she stayed in the moment and dealt with what was going on as far as her asthma was concerned, she probably would have been able to overcome the asthma attack without passing out and having to eventually end up in the hospital for further treatment. So those are two very big takeaways that I take away from that story. And it takes a lot of courage, especially for people in the public eye, because again, society and peer pressure puts on the image that these people are perfect, that they don't have any problems, that they don't deal with the same things that we deal with on a day-to-day issue. And it takes away their humanity. And so her sharing her story lets us know that she's human just like the rest of us. And that's something I believe if more people would just wrap their mind around it, then we would all be a lot better off.
Kind of opening up, talking about it. We're trying to break these barriers, break negativity with mental health, because it's, as I do this, it's kind of like I have a therapy session each time I record an episode, which is great.
Right.
And, when is it going to be, you have a torn ACL, you're out 4 months. Oh, I have some depression I'm working with. I'm going to work on that for 2 months. But no, it's not looked at the same. And we know it's a barriers we're trying to break. And, there's a lot of fear from job loss, because people aren't as accepting of the mental health difficulties. But we're going to dive right into that today. I'm sure we have a lot of good stuff, a lot of great dialogue so far. So I'm excited to see where this is going to go, Sharice. It's time for the main event. On each episode, my guest and I will go over this series of 6 questions, which only slightly varies depending on if my guest is speaking on their own or others' mental health. Today, we get a little bit of both. So I'm excited to add all this value to our listeners. You ready, Sharice?
I'm ready.
Great. Well, many would agree that the more common or talked about types of mental illnesses are mood disorders, anxiety disorders, or schizophrenia disorders. What areas do you come across the most?
I would say anxiety disorders. And I say that because, again, as I just said a minute ago, a lot of us are so anxious about what's going to happen next. What's the next step? What does the future look like? And we're missing out on living in the moment. And so you see a very marked increase in the numbers of diagnosed cases of anxiety in our current society. And that's and in these uncertain times, the economy, the stock market, and a lot of people have built their hopes, dreams, lifetimes, futures on those things. And the uncertainty is, of course, gonna skyrocket people's anxiety. And so that is something that I am seeing a lot more, not just in people that I'm working with personally, but in the society in general.
Yeah, I like the way you said that too. I mean, we got to keep the awareness building at the end of the
Yes.
day. Definitely with that. Now, you mentioned you had personal experiences with mental health at a young age. I'm very interested to hear this answer because I think it can inspire a lot of people. When did you first decide that a career relating to mental health was indeed the right career for you?
Um,
Was
so
there a certain moment, or was it,
is
you
this
always
an
know?
adult podcast, or can I be frank?
If you'd like to, yes.
Okay. There were 2 incidents that underscored my desire to help people. One was, I would say in my mid 20s, I witnessed my grandmother who had been she had been in an abusive marriage. So there were so many mental health issues going on in my family of origin. And so she had a partner after she got divorced. They didn't get married or anything, but they had been together probably since I was a child. And I'm in my mid 20s, and he decides that he wants to do something different. And I was trying to call my grandmother for a few days, couldn't reach her. So me and my aunt, we go to the house, and my grandmother is like, the house is completely dark, which was so not her. She's the type of person that gets up in the morning, opens all of the blinds, if it's nice outside, the windows, that kind of thing. So the house is completely dark. It's dusty, which again was not her. And she's in the bed. And that was my first time recognizing and making the connection up close and personal that I was looking at depression. And my grandmother, though she was a functional alcoholic, she worked, she provided for her children, for her grandchildren. And so to see this woman who had persevered, who lived through almost 20 years of physical abuse, to see her just, lifeless, for lack of a better word, that shook me to my core, because this is the person that I looked up to. This is the person who taught me about becoming a woman and, things like that. And to see her so defeated in that moment is something that I will never forget. And I think from that moment, there was something about people that were just drawn to me. And I've been to seminary, and in seminary, one of my seminary classmates said to me, sick bitches are drawn to you. Like, it's like they just know that you are the person that they can come to, that they can talk to about their problems. And I was like, okay, that is so not the appropriate description, but I understood what she was saying.
Yeah.
And so I started then to understand that I had a passion for really wanting to help people solve their problems, find a different way of looking at things, new perspective, knowing that situations are not always permanent and that there is another side and another way out. And so, and in seminary, I always knew that I was drawn to pastoral counseling, and that wasn't going to be enough. So that led me to going into a doctoral program where there was more focus on the clinical side, the diagnostic side. And, I had the spiritual side covered as far as being in seminary, but then I also got the diagnostic side and the treatment side.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for sharing that. Very courageous. I appreciate that because it's going to help a lot of our listeners here, Sharice. Now, you have all this diverse experience as far as I'm speaking, where we have diversity coming from personal, professional, and your doctoral program, which is the educational side of things. I'd love to hear your input on this. As what advice can you give to our listeners as what may be considered a potential early sign that they may be developing a mental illness?
One of the first early signs I would say is when you start to lose interest in things that bring you joy, not interest in things that you do out of habit or routine, but things that bring you joy. For some people, going to work is habit and routine. For some people, they really enjoy their jobs and they love what they do. So when you start to feel that lack of joy for things that normally would just make you upbeat, things that you would look forward to, then that's a sign that there's probably something wrong, and it would not bear the burden of having a conversation with somebody.
Right.
People that have for people that work outside of the home and that are not entrepreneurs, if you have a job with benefits, most of your jobs have what is called an employee assistance program or EAP program.
Yeah.
And I would strongly suggest that if you have a regular 9 to 5 job, and I'm not saying regular in a derogatory way because I too have a regular job, but that you would utilize the benefits and the services of the employee assistance program. Number one, it's free. Number two, most employee assistance programs or EAP programs are open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So if you don't want people to know, you don't have to, and they're totally confidential.
Okay.
So they're gonna call back to your employer and say, hey, this person is maybe having a mental health break or something like that. It's worth having the conversation. And it could just be that there are a lot of things going on in your life at one time and you don't understand the impact of how things are. If you've got a child that's graduating from high school, and so you've got graduation, you got prom, you got banquets, you got all of these college applications, and then you just bought a house a few months ago, and so you're trying to get the house situated, and you need new tires on your car, and all of this stuff is happening to you at one time. It could be that just you're overwhelmed. It may not, there's a mental health issue. So, but having that conversation with an impartial party can help you to determine if it's just a moment of overwhelm or if it's actually something that requires a little bit more attention.
And that's interesting you say that because, I like to bring it up as well, where it's okay to feel sad. It's okay to have different emotions. It's, however, knowing when point A reaches point B. And one of the many missions of this show is hopefully providing enough information and detail of value where people can recognize that bridge. When they're that far across the bridge, it may be time to seek help. So that's definitely ways, to know something may be going on. But once there is something going on, or maybe people just want to improve their mental health, either scenario, If you could pick three, and only three here, Sharice, I say three because I want the three most important things our listeners can do on a daily basis to improve that mental health, or short-term basis maybe. What do you got for us?
The first thing is, don't suffer in silence. Don't deal with it in isolation. When you feel that, again, if you feel like you're losing interest in things, if things that normally bring you joy don't bring you joy anymore, talk to somebody. It may even just be a friend, but start the conversation with
Yes.
another person. Don't suffer in silence. That would be like number zero if I could, if I
Yeah.
something that was, because too many people suffered in silence and they don't say anything. And then you see an increase in suicide and things like that. So number one, do not suffer in silence. Number two, do not be afraid to ask for help. Take the stigma off of getting help. There is, especially in the African American community, there is a stigma attached to mental health. Take the stigma away. And the reason why
Yeah.
I speak about this often is that most of us were raised in homes where mental illness was prevalent. However, the way our mothers and grandmothers and fathers and grandfathers dealt with it is different. So for them, a man may go in his garage and have a couple of beers, and that was his way of dealing with his thing.
Right.
Or our mothers and grandmothers, like both of my grandmothers love to cook. So them cooking a meal and, my mother's mother loves to entertain. So having people over kind of overshadowed her
Right.
mental health issues. So they dealt with things differently than the way we do it. And so we grew up seeing what we can say now was probably depression and
Yep.
anxiety disorders, mood disorders, but the way that they dealt with it was different. So I would say take the stigma off of mental health. That would be number two. My third thing would be to not be afraid to go to therapy.
Like that. Thank you.
Do not be afraid to go to therapy.
I myself prolonged it for so long after my accident, just saying I don't need it. And once you do, you can't always find the right person to talk to. It might take some trial and error, and once you do, it pays a tremendous benefit and service to yourself because it's an unbiased third party that gives you the things you need to hear and the tactics for me, ways to improve my mental health, short-term exercise, doing Sudoku, little things stimulate your brain while you're watching TV.
Right.
And then part of this show too, you gain so much perspective. You never know what will resonate with you as things work for everybody differently. We touched on that earlier.
Right.
It could be all different. And, those are definitely some good ways to do
And
it.
the caveat that I would add to that,
Yeah, please.
and you said it perfectly, you might not always find the perfect fit right off the bat. If a therapist does not make you feel comfortable, if they do not make you feel open to sharing, if they are abusive, verbally, mentally, then that's not the therapist for you. Don't be afraid to seek a different therapist. Don't be afraid to ask for recommendations because you never know who among you may also be going to therapy. And
Yes.
social media is so prevalent now. And I've seen people actually reach out on social media and say, hey, who has a good therapist? And people have taken those suggestions, but don't think that the first person you get, if you don't feel comfortable, it's just like I wouldn't go to a doctor that made me feel uncomfortable. I wouldn't sit in a dentist chair with my mouth exposed make me feel uncomfortable. It's the same thing with a therapist. Make sure that there is some comfort in that relationship. Now, there's going to be some discomfort. So every
course.
doctor is not a comfortable experience. And every time I go to the dentist, it's not but you want to find some comfort in that relationship because like we trust doctors with our lives, pretty much, we're trusting this person with our mental health, which could potentially really be your life. Sometimes this is a life or death issue.
Yes. I couldn't agree with you more. And, alluding back to, you kind of went back to the points where You got to learn to be uncomfortable, get out your comfort zone. Yeah, it's uncomfortable telling a therapist you may not go back. But that's a minor step in, stepping outside your comfort zone, because once you bridge that gap and you get to someone you like, you did yourself a complete service. So,
and when you find the good fit with the therapist, they will call you out on your shit.
that's what you need, right?
And I remember talking to my therapist about an issue, and my therapist was like, "So, what did you think you were going to do?" And I'm like, "Well, I thought," and she was like, "Why?" And I'm like, she is really calling me, like she is supposed to agree that, and and then I had to
Right.
stop and say, you know what, I was completely wrong. And this was what I was doing was totally codependent, dysfunctional, blah, blah, blah. Because just because I'm a mental health professional does not mean that I always get it right.
Right.
Too, don't always get it right. And I too work with somebody to help me keep things in perspective, especially when you are working with other people and you're listening to sometimes these heart-wrenching stories and people are really pouring their lives into you. You need an outlet to deal with that. Now, one of my outlets is reality TV, but then you have to come back to reality and actually deal with it. And we're all human. As I said before, we all have issues and things that we deal with. And so it's important to keep that in check and keep that balance.
Yeah, thank you so much for normalizing all that. It helps when you're trying to resonate with people. So that was a big service you just provided. And another service I'd like to ask you to provide was some long-term initiatives. Those are great things our listeners can start doing right away, start to feel good. But let's delve a little longer here. What are some things that might take a little more work?
So, if you're going to therapy is going to take work. And it's not the first session, you're not gonna feel better. You will probably feel worse. But it's an ongoing process. It's just like baking a cake. When you put a cake in the oven, it doesn't look good. It doesn't look appealing. Like you
Right.
put a slice into it while it's all lumpy and wet and everything. It takes time. It has to bake. It has to do what it does in the oven. And so that's the same thing with going to therapy. You have to let it culminate. You have to let it come together and do what it is that it's going to do for you, which is hopefully to help you figure out. Now, it's not going to solve your problems. So don't go into it thinking that the therapist is going to solve your problems. A good therapist job is to help you figure out how to solve your own problems and maybe give you some tools and some techniques and sometimes maybe even some medication to help you figure those things out. So that's a long-term solution. Another long-term solution is, and I will give you an example. So I just mentioned that I'm a fan of reality TV. And one of the shows that I watch is My 600-Pound Life.
Okay.
And I like the show because one of my coping mechanisms was to food. Food was my comfort.
Right.
And it's funny that when you watch them before they get to the part of dealing with the mental side of why they overeat and those things, that they're always in denial about almost everything. So they'll go to the doctor, he's put you on a diet, you didn't follow the diet, and they always say, oh, I wonder what the scale is gonna be. And then, when they get in front of the doctor, like, well, I ate chips one day, and the doctor I love the doctor because he's very in your face. Like, okay, if one day wouldn't have made you gain weight or not lose any weight,
Right.
had to do this repeatedly. And so I say that to say that a lot of times we don't want to do our own work. And that's a long-term solution, is doing your own work. Work on yourself. Spend some time thinking about the issues, thinking about, and it's going to take time to make those connections.
Yes.
Because we don't have it all figured out in the beginning, which is one of the reasons why working with a good therapist is a great thing. But nobody can help you if you don't take ownership of what you're doing to yourself.
I like that.
And that could be some of the things that we do that contribute to our decline, to the decline in our mental health. We don't realize it. It could be codependency. We could be preventing somebody else
Mhm.
be in a codependent relationship where we both need mental help and neither one of us are getting it because I'm trying to save you, you're trying to save me, and we can't save ourselves. You have to, the one thing to remember is when you get on the airplane, they tell you, put a mask on yourself before you try to help somebody else. That is my number one advice when it comes to mental health. Put the mask on yourself. Save yourself first, because if you're in the process of dying, you can't breathe, you can't take in any oxygen,
Right.
you're gonna fall on the next person and probably kill them too.
Mhm.
Now they've got all of your weight on them and they're trying to get their mask. So put the mask on yourself. The one last thing that I would suggest is be intentional with what I like to call your mental garden.
Okay.
Be intentional on the thoughts that you plan. Be intentional on what you want to manifest in your life. Be intentional on what you allow to go in and come out of your mind. Our mind is our own personal garden, and how you cultivate and grow that mental garden says volumes moving forward in life. And we need to be more intentional. We can't take in everybody's problems. We can't take in everybody's situations. We can't, it's some stuff that is our stuff
Right.
that we need to take in, that we need to just, I'm not even going to deal with that. I'm not even going to address it.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's people too. But be very intentional and purposeful about how you cultivate your mental garden.
You're right, because you have to, everybody's so quick to help other people, and you have to work on yourself first, or what, you can't really do a full service. But you're spot on, like the whole episode, you've been giving us great value. But as we're working on ourselves, we're talking about things we can do to improve ourselves first. What are some things that you're doing for raising awareness for mental health in the near future? What are some things we're working on? We know you have so much experience. What's next for you, Doc?
So, one of the things that I like to do is I have a background in healthcare. I've been working in the healthcare space for probably about 16 years now. And so I like to bring awareness to things when there's like National Awareness Month, so Domestic Violence Awareness Month, Heart Health Month, that kind of thing, because mental and physical go hand in hand. And so just being aware of these type of things, because sometimes they creep up on you and it's like, oh, today is red for Heart Month Day and that kind of thing. And so I try to keep people via my social media outlets, interested in that. I also try to there are a lot of people out there that provide so much inspiration if it's not coming from me directly, but I try to connect people with other people in the social media space who are very positive, who are very uplifting. And then sometimes there are times when I may post something that's controversial. I'm
Right.
calling somebody on their shit. I might be calling myself on my shit. You never know. We all have those days and those times, but it's keeping people aware. It's encouraging and uplifting people, and hopefully, I want people to always leave with something that they can take with them that may not be an immediate solution, but they can come back and say, you know what? I remember that Dr. Sharice said X, Y, and Z, or, I heard, or I saw this on her page and that kind of thing. And so leaving those lasting impressions.
Well, I think you're definitely going to leave a lasting impression on a lot of our listeners because you created such positive value today. So thank you so much, Sharice, for coming on. I know our listeners will all see that value. I really enjoyed how you gave us, a full circle perspective. You delved into your education. You gave some personal experience, which was very courageous, as well as professional experience. So thank you for that. I also enjoyed how you gave our listeners some tips for their 9-to-5 people out there with their employee assistance plans that they may not be capitalizing on, when there are a lot of undercover resources that they can improve their mental health with. And it's always nice to hear someone in professional capacity, say, hey, sometimes you won't find the right fit right away. That is a normal thing. You're not supposed to just go to everything work out right away. So I
Right.
can't thank you enough for all the great information, but it is time for the last word. And this is something I do on my other podcast that's called What It's Really Like to Be an Entrepreneur, because I really want my listeners to get to know my guests. Is there something you
Okay.
want to stop and share before we end off with our listeners that we did not get to touch on today?
Actually, I'll leave you guys with something else that I say often. I am a big fan of a very, very powerful thought provoking person by the name of Ernest Holmes. He writes some very powerful books. And one of the things that Ernest Holmes underscores is that thoughts are things. And if you think about mental health in your mind, and I mentioned your mental garden, that your thoughts are things. And
Mhm.
every time you have a thought, you're planting that thing. And so if it's negativity, that's what you're planting, that's what you're eventually going to produce. If it's positivity, if that's what you're planting in your mental garden, that's eventually what you're going to produce. And so I would like to encourage people to just begin to think of your thoughts as things. And when you have thoughts, as we all do, good or bad,
Yep.
think about, do I want to plant this or do I want to pluck it out? And do act accordingly, plan it or pluck it out. And I just want people to remember that and understand the power of your thoughts.
I love the way you put that. I think that's a very valuable message to leave on. So thank you for that. Would you mind just sharing your professional social media website or ways for our listeners to follow your endeavors, seek your advice, or request those services?
Absolutely. So I am on Instagram at Dr. Sharice, and that's Dr. Dr. period Sharice, and that's spelled Sharice. Same on Twitter, I'm Coach Sharice 7, the number 7 on Twitter. And then I'm also on Facebook under Dr. Sharice as well. So you can find me on either of those platforms. I do also have a website, drsharice.org. The website is down right now because I'm in the process of rebranding and revamping it, but
Okay.
it should be up within the next few weeks. My guess is, now that I have a little downtime, hopefully I can.
Right. Because we're recording this in the heart of coronavirus. But by the time I air this, I'll make sure that your website's up. That's no
Yes,
problem at all. But be sure to
yes.
also check out the show on Instagram and Facebook at A Mental Health Break and on Twitter at Podcast by Lanci. I'm at Vincent A. Lanci on all social media and YouTube, and my website is vincentalanci.com. Be sure to check out my book, Left for Dead, A Story of Redemption, on Amazon now. But be sure to DM me or email me. I do want to hear what you think. If you like today's episode, please continue listening and rate A Mental Health Break with Vincent A. Lanci 5 stars. I work hard to find value delivering stories for you on each episode. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you all in the next episode of A Mental Health Break with Vincent A. Lanci.